Hello and welcome back to another social studies video. This week is our fifth week, and we're going to be covering the 13 colonies and the French and Indian War today. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So, what I first want us to remember is the time framing of all of this, okay? So, whenever I'm talking about the time framing, remember the time period we are in. Think about the technologies that are around at this time. Think about what life would be. I know there wasn't air conditioning around at this time or any of the modern appliances like we currently have. So, just to give you a little bit of time framing, I'm going to go ahead and start. We are now in the 1700s. People have been living in America from Europe or enslavement for nearly 100 years. The winters are rough. Farms are starting to establish all over the colonies. More and more people are coming over. Survival is very hard, but the colonies are maintaining, and we're focused on the East Coast. Remember, we're talking about the 13 colonies that were established by Great Britain. So, as a quick review, I have a map of the 13 colonies, and we can see that they're all on the East Coast, and they had all started popping up from we know Jamestown's establishment in 1607 all the way to the early 1700s, with Georgia being the last of the colonies, and these would end up being the first 13 states. But an easy way to divide the colonies is by their geography. So when we're talking about the New England colonies, we're talking about the most north colonies. So on our map, the furthest north colonies, the New England colonies. You have Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Those are the New England colonies. And we're going to get into kind of their way of life. Following that, you had the middle of the colonies, which were in the middle of the New England, and the southern colonies, and they also had very specific ways of life. These colonies were Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. And lastly, the southern colonies, which were Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. All of these make up the 13 colonies. Please make sure we've got them memorized, because hint, it may help you with some of your homework for this week. Following the 13 colonies, more specifically, their way of life. So the life of a colonist, kind of broken down by region. Religion was very important to the colonists, but especially in New England, we know that Puritans had come over in that area in Massachusetts from Plymouth. Fishing was their main industry, so the way that a lot of people made money was through fishing. They also were shipbuilders, so they would build boats, and these ships would be very important, um, as we'll see later on in the American Revolution. But New Englanders were fishers and shipbuilders. Following that, in the middle colonies, this is where you had the most diverse group of people from all over the other countries. So you had Germans who lived in the middle colonies, you had Brits, you had French people, and even some Spaniards. All of these people would kind of be a melting pot in the middle colonies. So you had a lot of diverse culture and diverse ideas from all over Europe. Um, and the middle colonies were used to ship things, so they would ship goods back and forth to New England and the South, as well as across over back to Europe, and even with the Native Americans as trade started to pick up. They were also used for farming and manufacturing, because if you think about it, um, even though a lot of these cities now are really big, like New York City, the New York colony had a lot of farms back then, but they did start with manufacturing, so they did start to actually build things on a mass scale. Um, Following that, you had farming. That was the most important in the southern colonies, mostly in cash crops like tobacco and cotton. So you had a lot of farming as the way of life in the South. And as a result of this, you had slavery, which was very prominent in the southern colonies. So the large plantations, they required a lot of people to work, um, and slaves were the most common form of workers for the southern colonies. And it's important to note that slavery was very prominent in the South, but as with all the colonies, it was legal everywhere. So slaves were not just in the southern colonies, they were as far as the middle and New England colonies as well, but you saw a lot of that existing in the South. And it's important to know that all of the colonies were self reliant and self governed. So that means there was no United States yet. Each colony kind of controlled itself and had their own way of life and laws. And they were self reliant, so these colonies um, grew their own crops, they had their own defense, um, they were reliant solely on themselves. But what would happen later on is we would have a French and Indian War, and you might have heard of this as called as the 7 Years' War. So, as a brief kind of overview of the 7 Years' War, is who fought. This was France and Great Britain, as well as Native Americans, but it was mostly between France and Great Britain. The Native Americans would pick sides, but we know from our other video and from studying France that the Native Americans tended to get along more with uh, the French people, so that's where the majority of the tribes sided with. So not all tribes sided with France, but the majority did side with France. So it was France and most of the Native Americans versus Great Britain. Why did it happen? It was a rivalry over land in the New World. So the New World, the Americas, remember, it was being colonized by a lot of people from Europe, and basically France wanted some land, and Great Britain wanted the same land, so they fought over it. What years did it happen? This is important to remember. It went from 1756 to 1763. It lasted 7 years, which is why it's also been called the 7 Years' War. And who won? Great Britain ended up winning, and as a result, they got more land. But more specifically, here's some key events of the French and Indian War. So, highlighting it earlier, remember it's called the 7 Years' War because it lasted 7 years from the years of 19 or not 19, I'm sorry, 1756 to 1763. Those 7 years span, that is when it lasted. And what had happened was you had France, who was up in Canada at this time, and they wanted more land, so they moved down into the Americas. Um, you also had Britain expanding west at this point, so they naturally collided in the Ohio River Valley. So whenever they collided, they both wanted the land, so they fought as a result of this. So whenever they were fighting over the Ohio River Valley, um, you had prominent figures like General Washington. You might have heard of a man named Washington who might go on to do bigger things in what would become the United States, but he was 21 at this time and he was a general in the British Army. So, whenever I'm talking about the British Army, I'm talking about the colonists at this point, okay? There might have been a few soldiers who Great Britain sent over, but the majority of this was the colonists. So you had General Washington and his forces fighting against the French forces and their Native American allies. But it was still not enough. And what happened was the British won and stopped France's colonization in America. So France still had a lot of land, but as a result of Great Britain winning, they would get part of Canada and basically stop France from getting any more land in the Americas. And it showed that the colonists could actually fight. But as a result of all of this, Britain was sending a lot of supplies, and it costed them so much money. And in order to get this money back, they raised taxes on the colonists, which we would see would not make the colonists too happy. Um, and having been in the Americas for so long, this would actually lead to the American revolutions, as Americans no longer felt like they were really British people due to their lack of help and their increase in taxes. They were kind of mad at Great Britain after having fought in this war, getting taxed as a result of it, and not seeing a whole lot of benefits. So this would heighten tensions, and now you kind of know what the French and Indian War and a little more about the colonies' industries are about. But just know that the key year of 1776 is coming, and tensions are rising with Great Britain. And we know what is going to be coming here soon. We know that war is coming. But that is kind of a brief highlight of what has been going on in the colonies for the end of the 1600s going all the way into the mid 1700s. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next week.